December 16, 1944. Deep in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German soldiers watched through their binoculars as American tanks rolled across the snow-covered landscape like dark green insects crawling across a white tablecloth. They laughed. They actually laughed. Because those tanks, painted in summer camouflage, stood out against the winter landscape like beacons screaming their positions to every German gunner within miles. The Americans were sitting ducks and the Germans knew it. But somewhere in a small Belgian village, 40 gallons of white paint vanished from a civilian warehouse in the middle of the night. And what happened next would turn the tide of one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. Because sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat isn't about superior firepower or tactical genius. Sometimes it's about 40 gallons of stolen paint and a sergeant who refused to watch his men die. The Ardennes offensive began like thunder breaking across a silent sky. Hitler had gambled everything on one final desperate thrust through the weakest point in the Allied lines. Over 200,000 German troops poured through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, catching the Americans completely by surprise. It was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where green troops could get their first taste of combat without too much danger, where exhausted veterans could rest and recover. Instead, it became a slaughterhouse. Private First Class James Mitchell from Iowa had been in Europe for exactly 3 weeks when the German offensive began. He was a tank driver, assigned to the 7th Armored Division, and he'd spent those 3 weeks learning how to navigate the narrow European roads without destroying every fence and building in sight. On the morning of December 16th, he was eating cold breakfast rations and writing a letter home to his mother when the first German shells started falling. The letter was never finished. Years later, it would be found in the wreckage of a destroyed farmhouse, the last line reading, "Mom, don't worry about me. This is the easy part of the line. Nothing ever happens here." The American tanks were M4 Shermans, workhorses of the armored divisions, painted in what the Army called olive drab No. 9. It was a dark green color designed for the forests and fields of France in summer. Beautiful for camouflage when the world was green. Completely useless when that world turned white. As the German offensive pushed forward and winter storms dumped snow across the Ardennes, those green tanks became death traps. German anti-tank crews could spot them from over a mile away. Artillery observers called in coordinates with ease. Panzer commanders picked them off like target practice. Sergeant William "Buck" Henderson had been fighting since North Africa. He'd survived Kasserine Pass, Sicily, Normandy, and the long bloody push through France. He was 28 years old but looked 40, with eyes that had seen too much and hands that never stopped shaking unless they were wrapped around something solid. On December 17th, the second day of the German offensive, he watched 3 of his division's tanks get destroyed in less than 10 minutes. Just sitting there in the snow, visible from every angle, while German 88mm guns turned them into flaming coffins. He watched the crews bail out, some on fire, others not making it out at all. He watched the medics try to reach them through the snow while machine gun fire cut them down. And something inside Buck Henderson snapped. That night, while the rest of his unit huddled in frozen foxholes trying to stay alive until morning, Buck went looking for paint. It wasn't a complex plan. It wasn't tactical genius. It was desperation mixed with stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable. The Army hadn't provided winter camouflage. The Army hadn't prepared them for fighting in snow. The Army had sent them into combat with summer equipment and told them to hold the line. So Buck decided that if the Army wouldn't save them, he'd have to do it himself. The village of St. Vith was behind American lines, barely. Its civilian population had mostly fled, leaving empty houses and abandoned shops. Buck knew there had to be paint somewhere. Farmers painted their barns. Homeowners painted their fences. Somebody in this village had white paint and he was going to find it. He moved through the darkened streets with Private Mitchell and 2 other men from his platoon, checking every building, every shed, every storage room. They found food, they found wine, they found tools and furniture and all the detritus of civilian life interrupted. But no paint. It was Mitchell who found the warehouse. A small building on the edge of town, owned by a merchant who'd apparently dealt in construction supplies. The door was locked, but that stopped being a problem the moment Buck put his boot through it. Inside, lit only by flashlights, they found their treasure. Row after row of supplies, and in the back corner, stacked against the wall, dozens of cans of paint. Not all white but some. Buck counted 40 gallons of various shades of white and off-white. House paint, fence paint, barn paint. It didn't matter. White was white. They didn't ask for permission. There wasn't time for requisition forms and supply chain approvals. German tanks were less than 5 miles away and getting closer. Men were dying because they were too visible. So Buck and his men loaded those 40 gallons of paint into a commandeered truck and drove back to their position. When their company commander, Captain James Sullivan, saw what they'd done, he didn't order them to return it. He didn't threaten court-martial. He looked at those cans of paint, looked at his green tanks sitting in the white snow like targets in a shooting gallery, and said 5 words that would save dozens of lives: "Get it on the tanks." What happened next was chaos of a different kind. You can't paint a tank the way you paint a house. There are no brushes big enough, no rollers designed for armor plate. The paint they'd stolen wasn't military specification, wasn't designed to adhere to metal surfaces, wasn't meant for sub-freezing temperatures. But desperation is the mother of improvisation. The tankers used mops, used brooms, used rags tied to sticks. They poured paint directly onto the hulls and spread it with whatever they could find. Some crews mixed the paint with snow to make it go further, creating a slushy mixture that froze almost as soon as they applied it. Others used diesel fuel to thin it out, making it easier to spread but harder to keep from dripping. Private Mitchell worked on his own tank for 3 straight hours in temperatures well below freezing. His hands went numb, then stopped feeling anything at all. The paint froze on his gloves, turning them into stiff clubs. His breath created clouds of vapor that obscured his vision. But he kept painting. They all kept painting. Because the alternative was to climb into those green coffins at dawn and wait for a German shell to find them. The job wasn't pretty. The tanks ended up covered in irregular patches of white paint, dripping frozen streaks, looking like they'd been attacked by very large, very angry birds. But from a distance, against the snow, they disappeared. Not completely, but enough. Enough to make German gunners second-guess their targeting. Enough to buy precious seconds that meant the difference between a hit and a miss. Enough to save lives. By dawn on December 18th, every tank in Buck's company had been transformed. The men were exhausted, covered in paint, many suffering from exposure to the cold. But when the sun rose and German reconnaissance patrols moved through the area, something remarkable happened. The Germans couldn't find the American tanks. They knew Americans were in the area, their intelligence had confirmed it. But the tanks that had been so visible the day before had simply vanished into the white landscape. The first test came at 0900 hours. A German panzer column, 4 Mark IV tanks supported by infantry, advanced down a forest road toward the American position. They were searching for the American tanks they'd spotted the previous day, planning to destroy them before pushing deeper into American lines. The German commander, a veteran named Hauptmann Klaus Richter, had personally observed those green tanks through binoculars. He knew exactly where they were. Except when his column reached that position, the tanks weren't there. Or rather, they were there but he couldn't see them. Buck Henderson watched through his periscope as the German tanks rolled past, less than 300 yards away. His hand was on the gunner's shoulder, ready to give the order to fire. But he waited. The longer the Germans couldn't find them, the better their advantage. He watched the German commander's tank stop, saw the commander himself climb partially out of his cupola to scan the area with binoculars. The man was looking directly at Buck's position, but he was looking for green tanks in white snow, and his eyes slid right past them. The German column continued forward, believing the American tanks had retreated during the night. They advanced into what they thought was an undefended area. They were wrong. When Buck finally gave the order to fire, the Americans had perfect shooting positions while the Germans were completely exposed. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. All 4 German tanks were destroyed or disabled, and the infantry scattered into the woods. The Americans didn't lose a single vehicle. Word spread fast. By midday, other American units were desperately searching for paint, any paint. Officers who would normally court-martial soldiers for theft were suddenly looking the other way as their men raided civilian properties. White paint became more valuable than ammunition. Bedsheets were torn into strips and draped over tanks. Lime was mixed with water and thrown onto armor. Some crews used flour, others used chalk. Anything that would break up the dark outline of an olive-drab tank against white snow. But it wasn't just about visibility. The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers who had been confident, almost cocky, about their ability to spot and destroy American armor suddenly found themselves uncertain. Tanks appeared where no tanks should be. Ambushes came from what looked like empty snowfields. The Americans, who had been reeling from the surprise German offensive, suddenly had an advantage. Not a big advantage, not enough to stop the German offensive entirely, but enough to slow it down, to make the Germans cautious, to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. Private Mitchell became something of a legend in his unit. The kid from Iowa who'd found the paint warehouse, who'd spent 3 hours painting his tank in sub-freezing temperatures, who'd help give them a fighting chance. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired and cold and scared like every other soldier in the Ardennes that winter. But when men from other companies heard the story and asked how they'd survived those first terrible days, they all pointed to Mitchell and said, "That kid found us paint." The battle for St. Vith lasted until December 21st. Buck Henderson's company held their position for 5 days against overwhelming German forces. They were eventually forced to retreat, but they retreated in good order, their white-painted tanks withdrawing through the snow like ghosts. Of the 20 tanks in the company that were painted that first night, 17 survived to reach American lines. In the brutal mathematics of war, that was a miracle. The story of the stolen paint might have ended there, just another small incident in a massive battle. But a war correspondent named Edward Wilson had been with the unit, documenting the desperate defense of St. Vith. He'd watched the painting operation, interviewed the men, photographed the results. His article, titled "The 40-Gallon Miracle," was published in Stars and Stripes on December 30th. It spread through the American forces like wildfire. Here was a story about American ingenuity, about soldiers solving problems the Army hadn't prepared them for, about refusing to be victims of circumstance. The article caught the attention of General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was racing north to relieve the besieged American forces. Patton was famous for many things, but one of them was his absolute intolerance for excuses. If his soldiers needed winter camouflage and the Army hadn't provided it, then his soldiers would make their own. He issued immediate orders. Every unit in Third Army was to acquire white paint by any means necessary and apply it to all vehicles. He didn't care where they got the paint. He didn't care about proper requisition procedures. He cared about saving lives and killing Germans in that order. Within 48 hours, hundreds of American tanks, trucks, and other vehicles were being painted white. The operation was chaotic, improvised, and completely against regulations. It was also incredibly effective. When Patton's Third Army smashed into the southern flank of the German offensive on December 26, the Germans found themselves fighting an enemy they could barely see. The white-painted American tanks moved through the snow like predators, appearing and disappearing, turning the tables on the German forces who had spent the first days of the battle with every advantage. Back in St. Vith, which had fallen to German forces, the Wehrmacht soldiers who had laughed at those green American tanks found themselves hunting ghosts. American units that had retreated were now counterattacking, their white-painted vehicles invisible until they opened fire. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers began reporting American tanks everywhere, seeing threats in every snowdrift, every white-covered hillside. The fog of war, already thick, became impenetrable. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, the German tank commander who had missed Buck Henderson's position that first morning, survived the battle but never forgot the lesson. In his post-war memoir, published in 1952, he wrote, "We were trained to fight the American Sherman tanks. We knew their weaknesses, their blind spots, their inferior armor. But we were not prepared to fight tanks we could not see. That white paint took away our greatest advantage, superior optics and gunnery. It turned the winter, which should have been our ally, into our enemy." The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, lasted until late January 1945. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Over 19,000 Americans were killed, with tens of thousands more wounded or captured. The German offensive ultimately failed, but at tremendous cost to both sides. And throughout that terrible winter, American tanks painted white with stolen civilian paint continued to fight and survive at rates higher than their green counterparts. Sergeant Buck Henderson was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the defense of St. Vith. The citation mentioned his initiative and resourcefulness in improving his unit's tactical position through improvised camouflage techniques. It didn't mention that he'd stolen 40 gallons of paint. The Army, when it chose to, could be remarkably understanding about such things. Buck didn't care about medals. He cared that 17 tanks from his company made it out when, by all rights, most of them should have been destroyed. He cared that men who should have died instead lived to go home. Private Mitchell survived the war and returned to Iowa. He never talked much about his service the way many veterans didn't. But he kept a small can of white paint in his garage until the day he died 50 years later. His family never understood why. They assumed it was some kind of memorial to fallen friends, which it was, in a way. It was also a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are won not with big guns and grand strategy, but with improvisation, desperation, and 40 gallons of stolen paint. The story of the white-painted tanks became part of American military folklore. It was studied at West Point as an example of tactical adaptation under pressure. It was cited in training manuals about the importance of camouflage. It inspired a generation of soldiers to think creatively, to refuse to accept defeat simply because they lacked the proper equipment. Because the lesson of those 40 gallons wasn't really about paint. It was about refusing to be helpless, about taking action when action seemed impossible, about finding solutions when the official channels had failed. What the story is often forgotten to mention is what happened to the merchant who owned that warehouse in St. Vith. His name was Henri Dubois, and he had fled the town with his family when the German offensive began. When he returned months later, after the town was liberated, his warehouse had been destroyed by artillery fire. Everything was gone. The Americans couldn't compensate him for the stolen paint because officially, no one had stolen anything. There were no requisition forms, no records, no paper trail of what had happened that desperate night in December. But Buck Henderson remembered. After the war he tracked down Henri Dubois. He couldn't give him back the warehouse or the lost inventory. What he could do was write a letter to the Belgian government explaining exactly what had happened, how civilian paint from Henry's warehouse had saved American lives, how that theft had been an act of desperate survival rather than casual looting. The letter worked. Henri Dubois received compensation from the Belgian government, and later from the American government as well. Not enough to make him rich but enough to rebuild. The two men met only once, in 1947, when Buck returned to Belgium to visit the battlefields where he'd fought. Henri insisted on buying him dinner. They didn't share a common language beyond a few words, but they shared understanding. Henry's paint had saved lives. Buck's letter had saved Henry's livelihood. In the chaos and destruction of war, it was a small moment of grace, of things working out the way they should. The tanks themselves, those white-painted Shermans that fought through the winter of 1944-45, almost all went to the scrapyard after the war. The military had no use for them. But one tank from Buck Henderson's company was preserved. It still bears the irregular white paint, now faded and chipped, applied with mops and brooms by freezing men who refused to die without a fight. It sits in a museum in Belgium, near the town of St. Vith, a monument to improvisation and survival. Visitors to the museum often ask why the tank is painted so badly, why the white paint is so uneven and sloppy. The museum guides explain about the desperate night in December 1944, about the stolen paint, about men working in sub-freezing temperatures with improvised tools. They explain that military perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was the goal. And that ugly, irregular white paint accomplished exactly what it needed to accomplish. On the side of the tank there's a small plaque. It lists the names of the crew members who served in it during the Battle of the Bulge. Next to each name is a small notation, survived. All of them survived. Not every crew was so lucky, not by a long shot. But this crew in this tank, with its stolen white paint applied by freezing fingers in the middle of the night, all made it home. The German soldiers who laughed at those green American tanks in the snow learned a hard lesson about underestimating American adaptability. They had every reason to be confident. Their surprise offensive had caught the Americans completely unprepared. Their tanks were superior in armor and firepower. Their troops were battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. They had every tactical advantage. But they hadn't counted on American stubbornness, on the refusal to accept defeat, on the willingness to steal paint and improvise solutions when proper solutions didn't exist. In the years after the war, military historians analyzed the Battle of the Bulge from every angle. They studied the German strategy, the American response, the impact of weather and terrain. Some noticed the unusual fact that American tank casualties decreased significantly after the third day of the battle, despite the fighting being just as intense. When they investigated why, they found the story of the white paint. It wasn't a decisive factor in winning the battle. The Battle of the Bulge was won through massive reinforcements, superior logistics, and the gradual wearing down of German resources. But that white paint saved individual lives, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. There's a tendency in military history to focus on the big picture, the grand strategies, the decisions made by generals and politicians. But war is also fought by individual soldiers making individual decisions in desperate moments. Buck Henderson deciding to find paint. Private Mitchell spending 3 hours in sub-freezing temperatures covering his tank in irregular white splotches. Captains and majors looking the other way while their men raided civilian warehouses. These weren't decisions that changed the course of the war. But they were decisions that changed individual fates, that meant some men went home instead of into graves. The story spread beyond the military. In the years after the war, it became a popular tale in American culture, representing American ingenuity and can-do spirit. It was sometimes exaggerated, sometimes romanticized, sometimes used to sell products or promote patriotic messages. The real story, the desperate story of freezing men stealing paint to avoid being killed, got lost sometimes in the retelling. But the core truth remained: when the system failed them, American soldiers improvised and survived. What's often lost in retellings is how close it came to not happening at all. If Private Mitchell hadn't found that warehouse, if Buck Henderson hadn't been stubborn enough to keep searching, if Captain Sullivan had insisted on following regulations and returning the stolen paint, if the German offensive had hit 12 hours earlier, before the tanks could be painted. History is full of these razor-thin margins, moments where things could have gone differently with just one small change. The German soldiers who laughed at those green tanks, most of them didn't survive the war. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, and when it failed, Germany's fate was sealed. Many of those soldiers who had been so confident in mid-December were dead by February, killed in the gradual collapse of the Third Reich. Some survivors later wrote about their experiences, about the shock of watching the Americans adapt and overcome, about the growing realization that they were fighting an enemy with limitless resources and unbreakable will. But on that morning of December 18, 1944, none of that future was clear. What was clear was that 40 gallons of white paint had vanished from a Belgian warehouse, and American tanks had suddenly become much harder to kill. The Germans noticed. They adapted their own tactics, becoming more cautious, taking fewer risks. And that caution, that uncertainty, gave the Americans time. Time to bring up reinforcements. Time to establish better defensive positions. Time to turn a desperate situation into a survivable one. Private Mitchell used to tell a story about the fifth day of the battle. His tank had taken up position behind a destroyed building, watching a road where German vehicles were known to travel. They'd been there for hours, painted white, barely visible against the snow-covered rubble. A German supply column came down the road, trucks full of ammunition and fuel. The German guards weren't even particularly alert. Why would they be? This was supposed to be behind their own lines. Mitchell's tank destroyed 4 trucks before the Germans even figured out where the fire was coming from. Not because the crew was particularly skilled, but because the Germans couldn't see them. After the battle, after the Germans had been pushed back and the bulge had been flattened, the army finally got around to issuing proper winter camouflage. White paint specifically designed for military vehicles, applied by trained personnel with proper equipment. It was much better than the improvised civilian paint. It adhered better, lasted longer, looked more professional. But it came too late for the men who fought in those first desperate days of December. For them, amateur paint applied with mops was the difference between life and death. Buck Henderson was asked once, many years later, if he felt guilty about stealing that paint. After all, it belonged to a civilian who had already lost so much to the war. Buck thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I felt guilty," he said, "about a lot of things in that war. About the men I couldn't save. About the destruction we caused. About coming home when better men didn't. But stealing that paint? No. That paint saved lives." Henri Dubois understood that. He told me once, through a translator, that if he'd known what we needed it for, he would have helped us load it on the truck himself. Property can be replaced. Lives can't. The legend of the 40 gallons of white paint became one of those stories that soldiers tell each other, a reminder that official channels and proper procedures aren't always the answer, that sometimes you have to break rules to survive. It was a dangerous lesson in some ways, an invitation to chaos and indiscipline. But it was also a necessary lesson, a recognition that war doesn't follow neat bureaucratic procedures, that survival sometimes requires improvisation and initiative. Today, modern military forces plan for winter camouflage. They have reversible patterns, vehicle covers, special paints designed to work in extreme temperatures. The lessons of the Battle of the Bulge, including the lesson of those stolen 40 gallons, have been incorporated into military doctrine. Soldiers no longer have to steal paint and apply it with mops. But the spirit of Buck Henderson and Private Mitchell lives on in every soldier who refuses to accept that they lack what they need to survive, who finds creative solutions to deadly problems. The merchant's warehouse in St. Vith was never rebuilt. The lot where it stood is now a parking area for the museum that houses that preserved Sherman tank. Sometimes, on December nights when snow covers the ground, museum staff say they can almost see the ghosts of those desperate American soldiers, loading cans of paint onto a truck, racing against time and German artillery. It's just a story, of course. Museums like their legends. But maybe those ghosts would be pleased to know that their desperate improvisation is remembered, that the 40 gallons of white paint they stole became a symbol of American determination and ingenuity. In the end, the story of the white paint is a story about human adaptability under pressure. It's about soldiers who were given an impossible situation and refused to accept it. It's about a sergeant who couldn't save everyone but saved who he could. It's about a private from Iowa who found paint when paint meant survival. It's about an entire army learning to adapt on the fly, to overcome obstacles through creativity rather than just firepower. The German soldiers stopped laughing about those green American tanks after December 18th. By then the tanks weren't green anymore. They were white and they were deadly and they were everywhere and nowhere at once. By then the hunters had become the hunted, and the winter that was supposed to favor the German offensive had become an ally to American survival. All because 40 gallons of white paint disappeared in the night, and desperate men refused to die without a fight. That's what war really is, beneath all the grand strategy and historical analysis. It's individuals making choices in impossible moments. It's sergeants stealing paint. It's privates working with frozen hands to paint tanks with mops. It's captains choosing survival over regulations. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small decisions, each one barely significant on its own, that together determine who lives and who dies, who wins and who loses. The 40 gallons of white paint didn't win the Battle of the Bulge. American industrial might won that battle. Superior logistics won that battle. German overextension and fuel shortages won that battle. But those 40 gallons saved specific lives, real people with names and families and futures. And in the end, that's what matters most. Not the grand sweep of history, but the individual human beings who survived to go home, to live their lives, to tell their stories about the winter they painted tanks white with stolen paint and refused to be defeated by circumstances. The museum in Belgium keeps careful records of visitors who come to see the painted tank. Many are veterans or their descendants, coming to pay respects to the men who fought there. Some are military historians, studying the tactical innovations of the battle. But many are just ordinary people, drawn by the story of the 40 gallons of paint, wanting to see physical proof that improvisation and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The tank sits there, its white paint faded and chipped, a monument to a moment in time when everything hung in the balance and desperate men made desperate choices that turned out to be exactly the right choices. It's not the most impressive weapon in the museum. It's not the biggest or most advanced. But it's the one with the best story, the one that reminds us that war is fought not just with weapons and strategy, but with human ingenuity and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And somewhere, in the records of the Belgian government and the U.S. Army, there's a file about 40 gallons of white paint that disappeared from a warehouse in St. Vith in December 1944. The file notes that the paint was taken without permission, used for military purposes and ultimately saved American lives. It notes that compensation was paid to the owner. It notes that no charges were filed. And then it closes with a simple statement that sums up the entire story: theft of civilian property in wartime is normally considered a serious offense. In this case, however, the theft directly contributed to the preservation of American lives and the successful defense against enemy forces. No further action recommended. Bureaucratic language for a bureaucratic file, but beneath it lies one of the great stories of World War II. The story of how German soldiers laughed at green American tanks in the snow, and how those laughs died in their throats when 40 gallons of white paint disappeared and the hunters became the hunted. It's a story about survival and ingenuity, about breaking rules to save lives, about ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. That's why we remember it. Not because it changed the course of the war, but because it changed the course of individual lives. Because somewhere in Iowa or Ohio or California, men who should have died in December 1944 instead lived to see their children and grandchildren. Because a sergeant refused to watch his men die. Because a private found paint in the darkness. Because 40 gallons disappeared, and history was written not in grand pronouncements but in uneven white splotches on green armor. The Germans stopped laughing. The Americans started surviving. And the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion, one improvised solution at a time.